220 missiles, 6 minutes. Two of the most powerful warships ever built by human hands, each surrounded by the most sophisticated naval defense architecture ever deployed, each carrying thousands of sailors and enough combined firepower to end a small war, both of them simultaneously requesting emergency rescue. Not one carrier, both, at the same time, in the same 6 minutes. And the distress calls that went out from those two ships were not the most devastating thing that happened in those 6 minutes. The most devastating thing was the silence that followed them. The silence from every American military asset in the theater that received those distress calls and could not respond fast enough to matter. If you think you already know this story, stay with me. Because what actually happened in those 6 minutes, how Iran fired 220 missiles simultaneously at two separate carrier groups, and what it cost the world before the 7th minute arrived. That story is nothing like the version the headlines gave you. And by the time this video is done, you will understand why the United States Navy is calling this the most catastrophic 6 minutes in the history of American naval warfare. Before we go any further, tell us where you're watching this from right now. Drop your country or your city in the comments below. This series now reaches viewers in more than 60 countries, and we genuinely want to know where this story is landing. Whether you are in the United States, the Middle East, Europe, Asia, South America, or anywhere else on this planet, put your location in the comments. It takes 5 seconds, and it helps us understand just how global this community has become. Now let us get into what actually happened. To understand how Iran fired 220 missiles at two carrier groups in a single coordinated operation and reduced both of them to rescue situations in 6 minutes, you need to start with the number itself. Because 220 missiles is not just a large number, it is a specific number. A number that was calculated, not chosen. Iran did not fire 220 missiles because it had 220 missiles available and decided to use all of them. It fired exactly 220 because its operational planners had, over an extended period of intelligence preparation, calculated the precise salvo density required to saturate two carrier strike group defensive architectures simultaneously to the point of complete intercept capacity exhaustion. And that number, according to their models, was 220, 110 per carrier group. 110 missiles against a defensive architecture that can engage a maximum of 84 separate incoming threats simultaneously across all platforms at full combat effectiveness. The math is simple and it is brutal. 110 inbound, 84 maximum intercepts, 26 guaranteed penetrations per carrier group, even assuming perfect defensive performance on every engagement. Iran did not assume perfect defensive performance, it assumed realistic performance, which in a simultaneous mass salvo engagement, against threats arriving from multiple vectors at multiple altitudes and multiple speeds, is considerably lower than the system's theoretical maximum. Against a real-world salvo of this density and complexity, the actual intercept rate drops, the actual penetrations rise, and 220 missiles across two carrier groups in Iran's operational model produced a penetration outcome that made rescue calls inevitable within 6 minutes. The two carrier groups targeted were USS Gerald R. and USS Theodore Roosevelt. The Ford, which appeared in episode 10 of this series, where it sustained significant damage from Iran's Fatah-3 hypersonic anti-ship missiles, had been partially repaired and returned to operational status following an emergency maintenance period in Bahrain, a decision that American naval planners made because the theater's carrier coverage requirements, following the loss of USS Nimitz in episode 13, could not be sustained with the remaining operational carriers without the Ford's partial return to service. Returning a partially repaired carrier to an active threat environment against an adversary that had already demonstrated the capability and willingness to strike carriers is a decision that the Senate Armed Services Committee will be investigating for years. But it is the decision that was made, and the Ford was in its operating area in the northern Arabian Sea when Iran's launch order went out. The Theodore Roosevelt was operating in the Gulf of Oman, approximately 340 nautical miles south of the Ford, far enough apart that their defensive systems could not mutually support each other, close enough that Iran could strike both simultaneously from launch platforms positioned between them. The missiles were a mixed salvo, not a single weapon type, but a deliberately heterogeneous combination of 3 different missile systems selected specifically because they approached their targets at different speeds, different altitudes, and different radar cross-sections, forcing the defending carrier strike group's Aegis combat system to simultaneously manage engagement solutions against threats that have completely different intercept geometries. The Aegis system is extraordinarily capable. It is capable enough to manage a mass salvo of a single threat type with high effectiveness, because once it has solved the engagement geometry for that threat type, it can apply that solution to every incoming round. Against a mixed salvo of 3 different threat types arriving simultaneously, The Aegis system must solve 3 separate engagement geometries at the same time, allocate its interceptor inventory across 3 different intercept profiles simultaneously, and manage the result in real time as the salvo geometry evolves during flight. The cognitive load on the system, and on the human operators who supervise its engagement decisions, is not 3 times greater than a single threat engagement. It is exponentially greater, and Iran knew this. The mixed salvo was not a logistics compromise. It was a deliberate cognitive overload strategy applied to the most sophisticated naval combat management system ever deployed. The first component of the mixed salvo was 60 NOR anti-ship cruise missiles per carrier group, 120 total. The NOR is Iran's most produced anti-ship weapon, a sea-skimming cruise missile that flies at wave-top altitude on its terminal approach to minimize radar detection range and maximize the time between detection and impact. At wave-top altitude, the curvature of the Earth itself limits the range at which a ship's radar can detect an incoming missile, because radar travels in straight lines, and the ocean's surface curves away from the ship's horizon. A NOR approaching at sea-skimming altitude is detectable at approximately 22 kilometers from its target. At the NOR's terminal speed of Mach 0.9, 22 kilometers is roughly 48 seconds of warning time. 48 seconds for the Aegis system to detect, classify, prioritize, and assign an interceptor to 60 separate inbound threats arriving simultaneously from multiple approach vectors. The system begins, it engages, it is very good at its job, but it has a finite number of engagements per second, a finite interceptor inventory, and 48 seconds. The second component was 30 Khalij Fars ballistic anti-ship missiles per carrier group, 60 total. The Khalij Fars is a maneuvering ballistic missile specifically designed for anti-ship use, a weapon that descends from altitude rather than approaching at wave-top level, requiring the Aegis system to simultaneously manage engagement solutions against both high-altitude descending threats and low-altitude sea-skimming threats at the same time. The Khalij Fars approaches from above, while the NOR approaches from the horizon. The intercept geometry for a high-altitude descending threat is completely different from the intercept geometry for a sea-skimming threat. Different radar track, different firing angle for the interceptor, different closing speed calculation, different fusing requirement. The Aegis system handles both. But handling both simultaneously, while the engagement clock is running and the first NOR rounds are already within 48 seconds of impact, is exactly the kind of multi-geometry simultaneous engagement scenario that degrades real-world system performance below theoretical maximum. The third component was 20 Fatah-2 hypersonic missiles per carrier group, 40 total. The same hypersonic missiles that appeared in earlier episodes of this series, Mach 13 in their terminal phase, maneuvering re-entry vehicles. The intercept probability that the Missile Defense Agency assessed as between 12 and 31% per round in real engagement conditions against this specific threat profile. 20 of them per carrier group, arriving simultaneously with the 60 NOR cruise missiles and the 30 Khalij Fars ballistic missiles. 3 completely different threat types, 3 completely different intercept geometries. 110 missiles per carrier group, all of them in the air at the same time. Iran fired all 220 in a launch sequence that lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Because the different weapons have different ranges and different flight times, and the launch sequence was staggered to ensure that all 3 weapon types arrived at their target carrier strike groups within the same 90-second intercept window, regardless of the differences in their flight profiles. Coordinating a staggered launch of 3 different weapon systems from multiple separate launch platforms, submarine launched, surface launched, and land launched, across a 4-minute and 17-second window to achieve simultaneous terminal arrival at 2 targets 340 nautical miles apart is not a military achievement. It is an engineering achievement. It required a level of launch coordination, timing precision, and real-time telemetry management that Western analysts had attributed to Chinese and Russian military capabilities and had not assessed Iran as possessing until the moment the missiles started arriving. The Ford's Aegis combat system detected the incoming salvo at maximum radar range and began engagement sequencing immediately. In the first 20 seconds, it successfully engaged and destroyed 11 NOR missiles, 4 Khalij Fars missiles, and 2 Fatah-2 hypersonic rounds. 17 kills in 20 seconds. By any previous standard of naval combat, an extraordinary defensive performance. But the salvo had 110 rounds and the clock was running. In the next 20 seconds, the system engaged 14 more NOR missiles, 6 more Khalij Fars, and 1 more Fatah-2. 38 total kills in 40 seconds. 72 inbound rounds remaining. The interceptor magazines on the Ford's escorting destroyers and cruiser were depleting at a rate that the combat management system was tracking in real time and flagging as a sustainability concern. Not a warning that engagement would have to stop, but a warning that the system was burning through its interceptor inventory faster than the engagement timeline was reducing the incoming threat count. The math was not converging in the defenders' favor. The Ford's close-in defense systems, the phalanx guns and the short-range rolling airframe missiles that represent the final defensive layer, engaged the threats that penetrated the outer and middle defense layers. They destroyed 19 more rounds in the final engagement window. Total Ford strike group kills, 57. Total penetrations against the Ford and its escorts, 53. 53 missiles impacting a carrier strike group. The Ford took 11 direct hits. Its escorts absorbed the remainder. The strike group's frigate, USS Constellation, was struck by 7 missiles in a 40-second period and sank in 11 minutes. The destroyer, USS Carney, took 4 hits and lost propulsion and steering simultaneously. The cruiser, USS Bunker Hill, which had expended its entire vertical launch system interceptor magazine during the engagement, took 3 hits after its defensive capacity was exhausted and caught fire across its entire midship section. The Ford itself, struck 11 times by a combination of Nor sea-skimming warheads and a single Fata II hypersonic penetrating warhead that went through the flight deck and detonated in the hangar, was listing 12 degrees to port and had lost 2 of its 4 propeller shafts within 4 minutes of the first impact. The Theodore Roosevelt's engagement proceeded along an almost identical timeline because Iran had designed both salvo packages to the same saturation density against the same defensive architecture. The Roosevelt's strike group killed 61 of its 110 inbound missiles. 49 penetrated. The Roosevelt took 9 direct hits. Its destroyer, USS Jason Dunham, struck by 5 Khalij Far's ballistic warheads in rapid succession, broke apart and sank in 8 minutes. The Roosevelt's flight deck, struck by 2 Fata II hypersonic warheads that impacted within 4 seconds of each other, was rendered completely non-operational. Both warheads detonated inside the carrier's upper deck structure, creating fires that the ship's suppression systems were containing but not extinguishing as the 6th minute of the engagement arrived. At 6 minutes and 14 seconds after the first missile impact, the Ford's commanding officer transmitted the emergency distress call on the International Maritime Distress Frequency. His transmission was 3 words, followed by the ship's position coordinates. The 3 words were Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. 22 seconds later, the Roosevelt's commanding officer transmitted an identical call. 2 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, each displacing more than 100,000 tons, each carrying more than 5,000 personnel, each representing the most expensive and most capable warships ever built, both calling for rescue in the same 6 minutes. Now here is where geopolitics meets money gives you what every other channel covering this story is missing entirely, because the Mayday calls are the military story. The financial story started 14 seconds before the first missile impacted. At the moment that Iran's launch was detected by American early warning satellites, that detection was communicated to the carrier strike groups. 14 seconds. In those 14 seconds, before a single missile had hit a single ship, the information that 220 missiles were inbound to 2 American carrier groups leaked from military communications networks into the financial intelligence systems that institutional traders use to monitor geopolitical risk in real time. It leaked not through a security breach. It leaked through the behavior of the financial assets that sophisticated institutional traders use as geopolitical early warning indicators. Treasury futures, oil futures, dollar index futures, gold futures, all of which began moving simultaneously in the same direction at the same moment, 14 seconds before the first impact. Because the traders whose systems monitor those geopolitical risk indicators saw the movement begin and correctly interpreted it as evidence that something catastrophic was in progress in the Arabian Sea. This is the financial system's version of radar. It is not as precise as military radar, but it is faster than any press release, faster than any official statement, and faster than any classified briefing. And what it detected in those 14 seconds, and in the 6 minutes that followed, produced market movements that make every previous episode of this series look like a minor fluctuation. The oil market did not spike. It broke. Brent crude futures, which had been suspended and restarted multiple times across this series and which were trading at $340 per barrel going into this episode, moved to $520 per barrel in the 11 minutes between the launch detection and the first official acknowledgement of the carrier distress calls. $520 per barrel. At $520 oil, the input cost of energy renders profitable operation impossible for every energy-intensive industry in the world simultaneously. Steel production, aluminum smelting, cement manufacturing, chemical processing, fertilizer production. Every industrial process that requires large amounts of heat energy, which is most of them, becomes economically non-viable at $520 oil before the cost is even passed through to the consumer. The consumer price effects of $520 oil at the pump, in the grocery store, in every product whose production and transportation depends on petroleum would take weeks to fully propagate through global supply chains. The industrial shutdown effects would begin within days. Both would arrive in a global economy that was already contracting at negative 8.3% annualized from Episode 12's carrier strike consequences, and had no fiscal or monetary policy headroom to absorb a further shock of this magnitude. The US dollar fell 14% against the euro, the yen, the pound, and the Swiss franc simultaneously in a 30-minute window following the distress call confirmations. A 14% single-session dollar decline has no historical precedent in the post-Bretton Woods era. The largest previous single-session dollar decline was 8.3% in Episode 12 of this series. The progression from 8.3% to 14% in the span of one additional episode tells you something precise and important about the cumulative erosion of dollar reserve currency confidence across this conflict. Each episode has not reset the confidence erosion from the previous one. It has added to it, compounded it. The dollar at 14% down in a single session is not responding to this episode alone. It is responding to the accumulated weight of every previous episode's demonstration that American military supremacy, the foundation of dollar reserve currency premium, is more defeatable, more consistently, by a more affordable adversary than any previous model of American military invulnerability had incorporated. The Federal Reserve's emergency facilities, activated for the fourth time in this series, failed for the first time to stabilize the Treasury market. Not because the Fed ran out of tools. The Fed does not run out of tools. It can create dollars in unlimited quantities and use them to buy Treasury securities in unlimited quantities, and thereby set Treasury yields at whatever level it chooses. The Fed failed to stabilize the market because the institutional sellers of Treasury securities were not selling because they needed liquidity. They were selling because they were repositioning out of dollar-denominated assets entirely, moving into gold, into Swiss francs, into Japanese yen, into physical commodities, into any asset class whose value does not depend on the continued functioning of the American underwritten global order. When institutional sellers are repositioning rather than raising liquidity, Fed purchases stabilize prices temporarily but cannot arrest the underlying repositioning flow. The sellers take the Fed's dollars and buy gold with them. Gold goes higher. The dollar goes lower. The repositioning accelerates. The Fed buys more. The cycle continues until the underlying cause, the demonstrated erosion of American military supremacy, is resolved or until the repositioning is complete. Neither resolution was available in the hours after the distress calls. Gold crossed $7,400 per troy ounce. The London Bullion Market Association suspended trading for the second time in this series. This time, not because it could not establish reliable bid-ask spreads, but because it could not source sufficient physical gold to satisfy the delivery demands of contracts whose holders were demanding physical settlement rather than cash settlement, because the institutions demanding physical delivery did not trust cash settlement in a currency that was simultaneously falling 14%. When gold market participants do not trust cash settlement in US dollars, the dollars function as the world's unit of account. The thing that makes it the reserve currency, not just the reserve store of value, is under direct challenge. Unit of account status is the deepest layer of reserve currency function, and the hardest to lose. It is also the most consequential to lose, because a dollar that is not trusted as a unit of account is a dollar that is not used to price oil, to settle trade, to denominate debt, or to hold as reserves. It is just a currency. And just a currency is not worth 14% more than the euro simply because America says it is. China moved in the financial vacuum that the dollar's 14% decline created. The People's Bank of China, which had been coordinating with the Federal Reserve on dollar support operations since Episode 12, quietly withdrew from the dollar support coordination in the hours following the distress calls and began instead purchasing euro-denominated and gold assets from its foreign currency reserve portfolio. China did not announce this. It did not need to. The behavior of Chinese reserve portfolio flows is tracked by institutional analysts with sufficient precision that the withdrawal from dollar support was identified and correctly interpreted within 90 minutes of it beginning. China's withdrawal from dollar support did not cause the dollar to fall further. The dollar was already falling. But China's withdrawal removed the largest single institutional buyer from the dollar support operation at the moment when that support was most needed. A decision whose timing communicates something specific about Beijing's calculation of where this conflict is heading and which outcome Beijing has decided to position itself for. Now here is the strategic question that the financial consequences of this episode make unavoidable. Iran has now, across this series, destroyed or mission-killed 4 American aircraft carriers, grounded every American fixed-wing aircraft in the Middle East theater, struck U.S. CENTCOM's forward headquarters, fired intercontinental ballistic missiles at Washington, breached a $2 billion airbase, and fired 220 missiles at 2 carrier groups, simultaneously reducing both to rescue situations in 6 minutes. The cumulative military cost to the United States across this series is measured in hundreds of billions of dollars of hardware, thousands of personnel, and the complete temporary loss of conventional military strike options in the theater multiple times. The cumulative financial market cost is measured in dozens of trillions of dollars of asset repricing, dollar reserve currency erosion, and global economic contraction that the IMF is now projecting at negative 11% annualized, a figure that exceeds the Great Depression's worst single year. And Iran's cumulative munitions expenditure across all of these operations, estimated by 3 independent defense analysis organizations from publicly available procurement and production data, is approximately $480 million. $480 million, versus hundreds of billions in direct military losses and dozens of trillions in financial market consequences. That ratio, the financial return per dollar of Iranian military investment, is the most important number in this entire series. Not because it makes Iran the winner of this conflict. The conflict is not over. The American response to the distress calls, the B-21 raiders, the submarine Tomahawk salvos, the cyber operations, the economic infrastructure strikes, is ongoing and devastating in its own right. Iran is paying an enormous cost in economic infrastructure, industrial capacity, and civilian welfare for the campaign it has run across this series. The ratio does not make Iran the winner. It makes Iran the most financially efficient military adversary the United States has ever faced. And financial efficiency, sustained over time, has a way of determining strategic outcomes in ways that raw military power cannot always override. The rescue operation that followed the distress calls recovered 4,218 personnel from the Ford Strike Group and 3,941 from the Roosevelt Strike Group before both carriers were confirmed as beyond salvage recovery. The Ford sank at 47 minutes after the first missile impact. The Roosevelt, burning but structurally more intact, was taken under tow by damage control vessels and held on the surface for 19 hours before flooding in. Its lower decks became uncontrollable, and it sank in 600 meters of water in the Gulf of Oman. The combined tonnage of naval assets lost in this single operation, the 2 carriers, 2 destroyers, 1 frigate, and 11 support vessels, represents the largest single loss of American naval tonnage since the Battle of Leyte Gulf in 1944. The combined replacement cost, at current procurement pricing, exceeds $62 billion. The combined training and operational experience lost with the crews who did not survive is not quantifiable in dollars. It is not replaceable on any procurement timeline. Before we get to the final question, 2 things. First, drop a comment right now and tell us what you think happens next. Does the United States have a response that resets this conflict in America's favor before Iran's financial war strategy completes its objective? Or has the ratio, $480 million versus dozens of trillions in consequences out, already crossed the threshold beyond which military response cannot reverse the strategic outcome? Give us your honest analysis in the comments. We read every single one. Second, if this series has given you a deeper understanding of what is actually happening in this conflict than anything else you have been reading or watching, share this video with one person who is following the story but not getting the financial and strategic depth it requires to be understood properly. Share it with whoever that person is in your life. Because the only way this community grows is if the people who found it bring others with them. The distress calls went out at 6 minutes and 14 seconds. The rescue ships are still pulling survivors from the water. The financial markets are still moving in directions that no model predicted and no central bank can fully arrest. And somewhere in Washington, in a situation room where every previous response option has been exhausted or constrained or demonstrated to be insufficient, a decision is being made about what comes next in a conflict that began with a siren over Tel Aviv and has arrived at 2 American carriers requesting rescue in the Gulf of Oman. This is Geopolitics Meets Money, 220 missiles. 6 minutes. Stay sharp.